Hello, and thanks for clicking on the video. With the 4 Elemental Space Marines finished, it's time to move on to something else, although we probably will revisit that series in some way in the future. One thing that I really want to do is make my first diorama. However, while I wait for parts to arrive and for my plans to solidify, I thought I would do something fun this week. In front of you are little baggies that contain all the spare parts from my kill teams. And if you have any kill teams of your own or any other Warhammer kits, then you know there are always loads of spare heads. And so, in this video, I'm going to take some of those spare heads that I have from all those kits, and I'm going to do something fun and silly that will also help me practice painting faces. As always though, I also like to really inspire people with these videos, so there will be something about this and why I'm doing this that gives you a reason to maybe think about doing something similar to this in your own builds and paints. So to kick things off, I grabbed 9 of those heads that I thought looked a bit like characters from pop culture, and I stuck them with blue tack to this wood block that I use for displaying my models. It's simple really, I'm going to paint these guys up as characters and you just have to guess who they are. And at the end I'll reveal who I intended them to be, and hopefully it all matches. When I usually paint faces, I usually use this recipe from Citadel, and I fall on it, it's a bit of a crutch for me, so I'm going to, in this video, challenge myself to not use this and only use other paints. So I began by grabbing succubus skin from Vallejo game color and started applying that as a base coat to the first head. A little clue for this first head is that it's actually inspired by the last video I made, and I should say I'm not going to reveal all of these characters until the very end of the video, so that should give you plenty of time to guess and have a think about who you think these characters are. And you should bear in mind that they're not going to be perfect because these Warhammer 40k heads are not supposed to be these characters, they're supposed to be their own, so I'm kind of morphing these heads into the characters with this paint job. The succubus skin layer is really only supposed to be the deepest of recesses, so I cover the vast majority of that layer with barbarian flesh from the armypainter fanatic range. When I'd covered everything except the deepest lines, the face started to look like this, and it's a bit patchy, so it needed a second coat. With the second coat I had this, and then it was time to do a third layer of highlights, the brightest highlights, with skin tone from Vallejo game color. And this only goes on the very brightest parts of the face, like the nose, the eyebrows, the top of the cheeks, and the other flaps around the face where the light goes. And with that layer complete, you can start to see that the face is really well defined with its creases, and it looks pretty good so far. For the face's lips, I did do a slight pinkish shade of the skin tone just to cover the very thin lines of the lips. The character I was trying to represent here has eyebrows, so I wanted to paint the eyebrows on in a brown. I think I used Brigandine Brown from the armypainter fanatic range. And because this character also has a beard in some variations, I wanted to paint the chin strap brown to be sort of reminiscent of a beard. Then it was time to do the eyes, and I used pure white to try and get the brightest kind of eyes that I can so they stand out, and then I dotted those white eyes once I'd got them in and was happy with a tiny bit of black for the pupil. I managed to get some okay eyes that weren't too big and weren't too small, and they looked like this. Then I decided to highlight the chin strap with the brown there and do the same highlight on the eyebrows as well. And it wasn't quite bright enough, so I had to do a second layer of highlights on those brown parts just to get them to stand out more. Then it was time to paint the really defining feature of this character, and at this point a lot of you will probably begin to guess who this character is. I used anthracite grey paint from AK 3rd Gen to block in this initial dark blue shape on the forehead. I then joined a line to that, going the whole way across the top of the head. Anthracite grey was only the base coat however, so then I had to use sunrise blue from Vallejo to add a much more light blue colouring to this shape, leaving only a tiny bit of anthracite grey at the very back of the head for the shadow. And then that was the first head complete, and this is what it looked like. Once again, I'm not going to reveal who it is right now, but at the end of the video I will reveal who all of these characters are meant to be. Also, for anyone not familiar with these heads, here's a 20p UK coin for scale. So now it's time for head number 2, and head number 2 is going to start in a very similar way. I'm going to use that same succubus skin, and then I'm going to use the barbarian flesh over the top of that as well. While the first head was a Space Marine head, this second head is actually a head from the Votan kill team that I have. And with my first 2 layers done, the head looked like this. Now it's time to deviate drastically from what we did on the first head, and this time I'm adding a very light grey paint. I think it was Brigade Grey from the armypainter Fanatic range. I deliberately added this layer patchy and a bit translucent so that some of the skin would still show through. And with that layer done, the face looked like this. And it was time to move on to darkening the eyes. I didn't use a pure black paint for this. I used heavy charcoal from Vallejo Game Color, and I used it to paint big areas of shadow around the eyes. I then grabbed a dark red, I think it was corn red from Citadel, and I used that to cover the lips. Except I went a little bit past the lips, up the cheeks as well. And I think at this point, some people might be able to start guessing who this one is. Next up was to grab some green paint and start applying it to the hair. And then I had to go back in and add white to the eyes. The eyes would also need pupils, so once again used black to dot some pupils in the middle of the eyes. To finish up, I did a quick highlight of some light green on the hair, then I also neatened up some of the eye areas and added in a little bit of a lighter grey around the edges of the dark areas around the eyes. I added a pinkish red highlight to the lips to make them stand out more. And finally, I added one last final highlight of a really lime green to the hair. And then that was head number 2 finished. This next character is going to be very different because he's blue. So I began by laying down a base coat of anthracite grey from AK 3rd Gen, which is a very bluish grey. Following that initial base coat, I decided to add some sunrise blue to my grey, using similar colours to the colours I used on the first character's head, and I made a brighter colour that I could use as my first highlight. Mainly when I'm highlighting faces, I tend to make my first base coat layer only the deepest, darkest recesses, so I make it quite a bit darker, and then this first layer of highlight normally covers about 95% of the whole face. I find with these really tiny faces like these, that definition is one of the most important factors in making them look good, and so really you just need high contrast between those dark shadow areas and the lighter areas. I think I jumped to using pure sunrise blue here and added that as an extra highlight on the face, on all the same areas for the other faces where I've highlighted, including the tops of the cheeks, the nose, the forehead, the chin, and the lips. There isn't that much more to this character, so I made sure that I highlighted the hair with some grey, and I kept it dark because I want this hair to be black. And then it was time to paint one of the more distinctive features of this character, and that is to give red pinkish coloured eyes. I then dotted those eyes with a really light pink as pupils. And then when I had another look at the face, I thought it could do with just a little bit more highlighting, so I did one little final layer of highlights just on the brightest parts with an even brighter blue, just adding white to my sunrise blue. And then that's face number 3 finished, and this one might be a little bit harder for you to guess, or not, I'm not really sure. To be honest, the next head, the 4th head, it actually looked like the character already, and that's one of the reasons why I chose it, and it's going to hopefully make it a lot easier for you to see who this is meant to be. For this face, I wanted to use dark greys, so I covered the head in an initial layer of a medium grey, and I think in this case I used uniform grey from the armypainter Fanatic. The initial coat I put down was too light, so I did go over with the darker coat, which is what you're seeing here. Going darker would make it easier for me to highlight this face up, so then I grabbed my lighter grey, which I think I then used ash grey from the armypainter Fanatic, and I used that as a highlight so that I could paint similarly in the way that I've done the other faces, where this layer covers 95% of the previous layer and I leave only the dark grey in the deepest recesses. For a final layer of highlight, I used Brigade Grey from the Armypainter Fanatic range and just did that on the highest parts as usual, as you've heard on the previous ones: cheeks, nose, lips, chin, forehead. Once again, and I'm going to say this a lot in this video, but I went to do the eyes, so I added some white into the eyes and then I dotted them with black. This character has darker grey or black areas around the eyes, it's almost like makeup, and I made sure to paint that in next. This character has a scar that's also really dark, so I used heavy charcoal to define that and make it really dark as well. Unfortunately for me, there was no facial hair sculpted on the bottom of this model, so I had to paint in some facial hair just over the skin with a dark brown. The next part was to paint in the identifiable feature of this face that will really make it recognisable, and that's to use red to paint some patterns over the eye on the left side. And this kind of makes good freehanding practice, which is definitely one of the skills that you can improve from doing these kinds of weird projects like this. Just like everything else, I had to make sure I added a highlight to this marking so that it would stand out in the raised areas like on the cheek and the top of the forehead. And then with that one done, that's the fourth head finished, and it looks like this. This face is my favourite so far, and I think most people will probably know who this is. Oh, and here's a quick look at the back, just so you know I continued the red line all the way over. Moving on to head number 5, this head was probably the hardest head of all the heads for me to do, and this one is base coated with a dark grey to start, using that heavy charcoal again as it was already on my wet palette. I then made a significant jump to a medium grey and started to add that over the face. To represent this character properly, I'm going to need to achieve lots of high contrast on this face, and I'm not super good at doing that yet, so this one might be a little bit harder for people to guess. After covering most of the face in that medium grey, I then jumped to an even lighter grey and began highlighting in smaller areas on top of the previous layer. I then took another jump in brightness, going all the way up to a near white to do another layer of highlights. This would be very small and only touch the top of the most raised parts. Because the contrast was going to be the key to this face, I went in around the eyes with a really dark grey, the heavy charcoal, and I really wanted to define them and make them more shadowy. I did a step next where I added back in some of my mid-tones just to ensure that some of the middle grey was still visible. And then it was time to highlight the hair, and I just did this with the grey once again, trying to keep things nice and dark because this hair's supposed to be black. And then after a final bit of refinement on the face just to be happy with it, it was finished. But can you guess who it is? And now it's time for head number 6, and it's time to get really serious. This one's going to be the most serious of all of them so far. So I grabbed green paint, and I began to slap that all over the face. I did the same thing again, and I used a much lighter green to cover 95% of the surface of this face, leaving only the dark green in the deepest recesses. With those layers done, the face looked like this. But it wasn't really the right green yet, so we had to keep going with highlights and get even more lime bright green. With those layers finished, the face looked something like this, and it was time to start putting in the eyes. So I used white first, just like all the others, and then I dotted them with a dark brown. After that, I knew that I could still go brighter on those highlights and that it would make it look better, so I did exactly that. I took a really light green, I think it was bile green from Vallejo Game Color, and I basically added this just as a small highlight to the very tops of all the raised areas like the eyebrows, nose, and forehead. At this stage, I needed to give my character some eyebrows, so I used a brown for that. I wanted to be really careful with these eyebrows not to make them too big and overpowering. So I took my time and very carefully just drew them along the ridge of the bottom of the brow. Oh, and then I started to snip the ears off. I don't know why I'd be doing that, that seems mad. This character must have different ears. Sculpting ears like this was really tricky, so they've turned out really massive, but I couldn't really make them any smaller than that, and I definitely wanted to include them, even though they're really goofy. I'll reveal them at the end, but let's move on to the 6th head now, and this time we are using yellow. Using yellow probably narrows down the number of characters that this could be, so you might be able to easily guess it pretty quickly on this one. I would also say that painting this character is very silly as well. I just couldn't resist. This head, it looks kind of strange. Initially I was getting Harkonnen vibes from like Dune movies, but I didn't go with that. I went with something else. Something iconic. Following some yellow base coats, I then used a desaturated brown all around the mouth area. And I highlighted that with an even lighter brown, still desaturated. I think because I had a lot of greys on my palette, I just added a light grey to the darker brown that I had to create my highlight. After highlighting around the mouth area, it was time to do the eyes, and I wanted the eyes to be a bit bigger than normal, so I didn't really mind if the white paint spilled out a bit over the rest of the eyes and the eyelids. Then I wanted to dot them with a nice circle in the middle with black paint. At this point, there was really only sort of one thing left to do on this character, and that would be on the top of the head to paint 2 black lines. And honestly, I'd be kind of surprised if you didn't know who this face was. It's a bit crazy to think that I could glue this head onto a Space Marine tomorrow and just have this character running around in 40k, though I dare not do that. Next up is head number 134. I can't believe I painted this many heads in the video. Why did I choose 9 heads? This is actually head number 8. I think it's number 8. And this one goes back to some of the earlier heads where I'm using succubus skin and barbarian flesh. With those 2 initial base coats down, I decided to do the eyes at this stage. So it was the same thing, using white paint to cover the whole eye area. I then proceeded to do a 3rd layer of highlights for this face, once again using skin tone from Game Color Vallejo. I dotted the eyes and I got pretty lucky. These eyes turned out pretty neat first try. And then the hair for this character would be brown, so I used a dark brown all over the hair. Just to bring the hair to life a little bit, I added a lighter brown for a highlight. Then it was time to do the defining features of this face. This is what may help you guess this one, although this one will be pretty tough to guess, probably the 2nd hardest after the 5th face. To make the concept of this video with the guessing of the characters somewhat doable, I had to pick faces that had like defining features, things that would make it clear who this was if you know the character. So I'm using anthracite grey to block in some shapes on the face around the eyes and on the forehead, and I'm using a tiny line of that anthracite grey on the chin. On the top of the head, I used a dark brown, some of that brigandine brown from Armypainter Fanatic, just to create a band across the top of the head between the hair and the blue markings. I then needed to crucially make those blue markings more blue, so I began to highlight them up with abyssal blue and adding more sunrise blue into the mix to get brighter blues. I then did a small highlight on the dark brown with a lighter brown, and then that was that face finished. Do you know who this one is? And then it's head number 9, last but not least, possibly one of my favourites by the end. And this time I decided to start with the eyes. Don't know why, just felt like doing it differently this time. And then I began to cover the whole head in a grey base coat. And we have done something like this before, but fear not, this is not the same character as head number 4. This character has a big beard, so I used a brown to paint this in. Using same browns on my palette, Brigandine Brown from the Army Painter. I was actually very economical with my paints on my wet palette this week, which was pretty good. I had to keep going with highlights as I've done on all the other faces, so I kept working up to lighter greys, more light greys in my mix, so that I could get a nice light grey highlight for the skin. Once again, I went nearly all the way up to a near white grey. Probably Brigade Grey from the Army Painter Fanatic. It's one of my favourite go-to near white greys. Then I highlighted the beard with a desaturated lighter brown, again added grey to the brown to get that lighter mix. It may even be the same mix that I used on the top of the previous character's head. Because I did the eyes earlier, I could just dot them quickly with a pupil. And then it was time to start painting some markings on the face. So I grabbed a darker grey, a deep grey from the Army Painter Fanatic, and I began to sketch on these face markings. These face markings were quite complicated, so it was good freehand practice. And to finish up, I drew a thin grey line through the middle of the markings on the back of the head. And that means that that's face number 9 finished. And you can see the markings from the top there, and it looks pretty cool, and maybe you know who this is. Maybe. But now that we have all the faces painted, let's do a final reveal. And yes, you can see those lovely ears have been painted up. So what do you think? Do you know all the characters? I'll reveal them at the end, but for now I just want to say it was a lot of fun to do this. One of the reasons that I did this was because I think sometimes we forget that we can do face markings and all kinds of interesting things on our miniatures. So hopefully this video has inspired you to either go out and paint a load of pop culture faces like I have, or to hopefully try and think about how you can add different markings and colours and things to your faces to make them more interesting in your armies. This is also a great way of getting a quick win because these heads didn't take very long and they look really cool. And maybe you can display all the heads together when you've painted hundreds of them, I don't know. So now let me reveal who all these heads are. Let me know in the comments if you think I did a good job and if you managed to guess who they all are correctly. If you enjoyed this video, please support me with all the good buttons below, and I'm going to start working on my next video, which is my first diorama, which I'm really excited to do and will be a bit more serious.